They gathered in prayer, 19 men cloaked in holy vows. At sunset, the bells of Greyfriars rang. By dawn, the Abbey was silent, its doors locked from within. No bodies, no blood, not a single trace of 19 priests. Only the echo of hymns no one remembers teaching them. Across a pale horizon, the silhouette of a hill rises. Quiet, stark, its ridgeline softened by centuries of wind. The hill is bare except for one structure at its crest. A long building of stone, its roof weathered black, its walls marked by time. Greyfriars Abbey. It has stood here for nearly 700 years. And in all that time, its doors have rarely closed. The Abbey was founded in the mid-14th century, at a time when kingdoms tore themselves apart in endless wars, when famine drove villages to ash, and when sickness spread like fire through the countryside. But on this hill, the church laid its stones with a different kind of permanence. It was not built as a sanctuary for pilgrims, not a cathedral for spectacle, but an abbey of silence, a place where discipline was not simply taught, but enforced. The first friars came barefoot. Their robes were gray, coarse, unadorned. They slept on straw mats. They ate only what they grew in the stony soil below. And each day, without fail, the bell told them to prayer. 6 times a day, always at the same hour, always in the same tone. Even centuries later, villagers said you could set your watch by the Abbey bell. Life inside Greyfriars was strict. A chain of obedience ran from the abbot down to the youngest novice. There were rules for how one walked, how one knelt, how one spoke, and rules for when one must not speak at all, because silence was the highest discipline. To break, it was to break the order of the house. Visitors wrote of it with awe, a hush so total, they said it was as if the walls themselves had absorbed sound. When one entered, one felt not merely hushed, but contained. Contained by stone, contained by time. And within that silence, the legend grew. The Abbey became known as a place where the chain of priests was never broken. Not once. Every priest who entered Greyfriars was replaced by another. Every generation produced new novices. Every novice grew into a priest. Every priest lived, served, and was buried within its grounds. The line was unbroken for 600 years. That kind of continuity is almost impossible. Wars came, kings fell, plagues swept through entire counties. But Greyfriars remained untouched. Villagers began to whisper that the Abbey was not merely preserved, but guarded, because while men died in the fields below, the priests remained. They did not flee, they did not scatter. They endured. The Abbey's reputation spread far beyond the valley. Families sent their sons here, not only for religious devotion, but for certainty, for discipline, for survival. In times of famine, the Abbey still had bread. In times of plague, its priests still walked upright. And in times of war, its gates stayed closed until peace returned. What began as faith slowly hardened into legend. The Abbey was eternal. And eternal things are rarely harmless. For centuries, Greyfriars seemed to belong to another order of time. Within its cloisters, the world outside could vanish. Generations lived and died within its walls, and yet to step inside was to feel the press of something older, something colder. The silence deepened, the discipline sharpened, and the Abbey's story became less about its devotion and more about its endurance. By the 17th century, the Abbey stone had darkened. Its roof lines cut a severe figure against the sky. Travelers described it not as holy, but forbidding, a place where the air itself seemed thinner. One diarist, passing through the valley, wrote simply, "It is not a house of God, it is a house of rules." Yet still, the chain of priests continued, through revolution, through reform, through centuries of change in the world outside. Greyfriars remained unchanged. Its rhythm of bells, its rules of silence, its iron discipline. But something wasn't right, because in silence things gather. Whispers left unspoken, thoughts left unshared. And while the Abbey's silence became its legend, it also became its prison. There are fragments of records from this period, notes from visiting bishops, letters from priests who had spent time within its walls. They speak of the same impression. An order of men bound too tightly, eyes lowered, voices clipped, movements exact. One bishop wrote, "They do not look like men of God. They look like men of stone." And yet, even these observations fed the Abbey's reputation, for outsiders saw it as strength, endurance, discipline made flesh. But for those inside, the silence grew heavier. Imagine living your entire life in the same cloister, speaking only when commanded, walking only by rule, praying at the same hours, to the same rhythms, until time itself no longer seemed to move forward. Days blur, years collapse into one another, and soon life itself feels less like something lived and more like something endured. This was Greyfriars. It endured, but it did not change. The villagers below grew superstitious. They said the priests of Greyfriars did not die like other men, that their faces, in death, were calm, that their bodies did not rot quickly, that the earth around their graves remained oddly cool. And so the Abbey acquired another name, the House of Quiet Death, a place where death was orderly, controlled, without struggle, and yet the priests kept coming. One replaced the other. The chain never broke, until one night, centuries later, when something did. But that is not where our story begins. Our story begins here, on the hill, with the Abbey in silence, with its walls holding centuries of breath unbroken, and with a legend so old, no one can remember where truth ended and ritual began. The Abbey stood. It always had, and it was waiting. The snow falls slowly. A thick white drift smothers the fields at the base of the hill. The trees bend under its weight. The valley is hushed, emptied of sound, as if the world itself has been pressed beneath a heavy blanket. And above it all, the Abbey waits. Greyfriars Abbey, in the winter of 1843. Its roof line is buried in frost. Its windows glint with faint orange light. Smoke rises thinly from its chimneys and vanishes into the pale sky. Inside, 19 men lived. 19 priests. They had been chosen. The records from that winter are unusually complete. A visitor, an archivist attached to the diocese, recorded their names, their duties, their movements. His notes survive as fragments, enough to paint a picture. And it is a picture that unsettles, because these 19 were not ordinary priests. They were described as unusually devout, men who seemed drawn not only to faith, but to silence itself. In the parish books, there are remarks about their character, words like disciplined, submissive, exact, but there are other words, too. A natural quietness, marked secrecy, a hunger for ritual deeper than the church required. That last phrase appears again and again, a hunger for ritual. It was not uncommon for priests to be devout, not uncommon for them to obey the bells, the hours, the seasons of liturgy. But these 19 went further. They multiplied the prayers. They extended the vigils. They fasted longer than required. They whispered each other about the structure of discipline as though it were a secret map. And slowly their devotion ceased to look like service. It looked like obsession. The townspeople noticed first. When they brought provisions up to the Abbey in the first weeks of winter, the priests barely spoke. They accepted bread with lowered eyes. They did not meet the gaze of the villagers. They moved in pairs, always pairs, as if bound by some invisible tether. One villager remarked, it was like they were already buried. They were breathing, but they were buried. At night, the Abbey windows glowed longer than they should, past midnight, until the black hour before dawn. The bell tolled irregularly, not only at the canonical hours, but at other times, unknown times, and when asked, the priest gave no answer. The silence was so complete, so unwavering, that the villagers began to fear them. And yet, the church approved, because to outside eyes, the Abbey had become a beacon of order. At a time when parishes elsewhere were plagued with corruption, drunkenness, or negligence, Greyfriars stood apart. Its 19 priests were unblemished, pious, tireless. No one dared question perfection of their devotion, but something wasn't right. The visitor from the diocese, his letters survive, noticed the same. He described the atmosphere of the Abbey as tense, though restrained. He wrote of priests who spoke with rigid courtesy, yet carried eyes that seemed distant. He stayed for 3 nights, and he left unsettled. His final letter contained only a single line: "They are together, but they are not among us." The 19 priests continued their winter in silence. The snow grew deeper. The road to the Abbey vanished under drifts, and the villagers no longer came up the hill. Inside, the 19 settled into their rhythm, their own rhythm. They fasted until their cheeks hollowed. They prayed until their knees bruised. They recorded nothing in the parish books except the barest entries. Rituals performed, bells rung, vigils kept. But there were gaps, hours unaccounted for, days with no entry at all. The silence spread from the Abbey into the records themselves. And what little remains reads more like an echo than chronicle. One faint clue remains in the writings of Father Matthew, the oldest among them, a marginal note in his breviary. The ink is faded, the hand unsteady. It reads, "They have chosen themselves." No further explanation, but those words repeat, "They had chosen themselves." It was not the church that selected the 19, not the bishop, not the order. It was the 19 who selected each other. And now, in the winter of 1843, they lived in a silence so complete that even the church above them did not hear. Snow buried the path. The villagers ceased their deliveries, and the Abbey closed in on itself. At night, travelers passing through the valley claimed they saw lights burning in the high windows. Not steady candlelight, but a flickering glow, flares of brightness that came and went, as if the Abbey itself were breathing. And faintly, too faintly to be sure, the sound of chanting, but not in Latin, not in any tongue they recognized. Those reports were never recorded in the official archives. They survive only in local memory. But the silence inside Greyfriars was real. 19 men, 19 priests, each bound to the other in ways no one outside could understand. The records from spring would later say that the Abbey was empty, that its halls were silent, that no priest emerged. But for that one winter, they were there, all 19, and they were waiting. The camera lingers on the Abbey roof. Snow drifts across its slates, catching pale light from a winter moon. The chimneys stand dark, the windows shuttered. Yet from within, something moves. Not the shuffle of feet, not the turning of a door, but sound. It began faintly, the villagers said. So faint they thought it was wind carrying through the valley. A low hum distant, rising and falling. But it was not the wind. It was voices. The priests of Greyfriars Abbey had begun to sing. At first, no one thought much of it. Hymns were part of Abbey life. The ringing of bells and the sound of prayer had drifted across the valley for centuries. But this was different. The notes were heavier, slower. They fell into the ear not like melody, but like pressure. A farmer walking the boundary of his field stopped in the snow, turned his head, and felt the weight of the sound sink into his chest. He later told his wife it was like standing too close to a thunderstorm. The voices moved together in harmony, but not in any harmony the villagers knew. Catholic hymns had structure, predictable rhythm, familiar refrains, but this was unfamiliar. The harmonies rose in unexpected intervals. Long stretches of silence broke them apart. Then, sudden bursts of layered voices pushed through, louder, sharper, before collapsing again into stillness. It was not prayer. It was something else. Children woke in the night, their eyes wide, their small bodies shaking beneath heavy blankets. They whispered that they heard voices drifting through the shutters. Not whispers, not echoes, but singing, a chorus pressing against their dreams. Parents tried to hush them. They said it was nothing but the monks keeping vigil. But the children insisted. They're too close. They're right outside. The voices did not follow the hours of prayer. They came at midnight, at 3 a.m. At times no villager could understand, and sometimes the songs lasted until dawn. One woman, her name was Margaret O'Dia, spoke years later what she heard. She had risen in the night to check her youngest, who had been coughing through the winter. The moment she opened the shutters, she froze. The valley was white with snow. The air was perfectly still. But from the abbey on the hill came a sound so deep, so resonant, it made her vision blur. It was not words she recognized, not Latin, not even language, but tone. One note sustained so long, she felt her teeth ache, and then another rising beneath it, and then another, until the whole sound seemed to swell, like a sea moving inside her chest. She pulled the shutters closed and could not bring herself to open them again until morning. But something wasn't right. The singing did not fade. It grew. By the middle of that winter, every villager had heard it. Some claimed it was beautiful. Others said it was unbearable. But all agreed it was wrong, because hymns lift the spirit. These did not. They pressed it down. There are scattered reports written by men who tried to document the sound. A merchant passing through the valley wrote in his journal that he stopped at an inn and found the locals silent, sitting by the fire, listening. He stepped outside and heard what they heard. A choir of many, he wrote, but not of earth. Later, the priest of a nearby parish came to investigate. His report still exists. It is written in careful, deliberate language. The voices do not conform to our liturgy. They are too many. The harmonics are unnatural. I cannot say whether it is devotion or delirium, but I cannot stay the night. He left before dusk. The villagers were left alone with the sound, and the sound changed them. They stopped sleeping easily. Dreams grew troubled. Families began moving their beds to the innermost rooms of their cottages, away from windows. Some blocked their chimneys to keep the sound from sliding down into the hearth. But the sound came anyway, through the walls, through the beams, through the marrow. And that's when one man heard his own name sung in the choir. He was walking the frozen path, carrying water from the well. The singing was rising from the abbey, low and heavy, and within the swell of voices, he heard it, a single word, his name. He dropped the bucket. Water spilled onto snow. He ran back to his cottage and refused to leave it for 3 days. By then, other villagers had their own stories. One said the hymns followed him into his sleep, and when he woke, he found blood on his pillow where his nose had bled through the night. Another said she heard the singing stop suddenly, abruptly, and in the silence that followed, she heard footsteps just outside her door. But when she opened it, the yard was empty. The fear grew sharper. Some families left the valley altogether. They took wagons in the snow, driving their animals along the frozen road until the abbey was out of sight. Others stayed and endured, but no one forgot the sound. Years later, when the valley was quiet again, the memory of those hymns remained. Men who had been children at the time would describe the weight of it decades later. It was like someone holding their hand over your mouth. One said, "It was like the hill itself was speaking," said another. And even now, in faded records, the description repeats. Hymns unfamiliar to Catholic liturgy. Notes that sank into the chest like a weight. A choir that sang not to God, but to itself. The abbey windows glowed at night. The snow reflected the light back down into the valley, and the voices carried through the dark, carried into the homes of the living, carried into their dreams, until silence itself was no longer silence. It was waiting. The camera drifts through falling snow. The abbey rises from the hill, dark against the twilight. Its roof is silvered with frost. The windows burn faintly with the glow of candles, but the light does not spread far. It seems to sink inward, swallowed by the stone. It was a Sunday in late winter. A parish family, father, mother, and 2 children, walked the road up the hill. Their names are lost to history. Only fragments of their testimony remain, passed into record by the diocese months later. But their account has never been forgotten. They came for evening prayer, and they were the last. The father would later describe the ascent, how the snow crunched beneath their boots, how the abbey bell rang, but rang faintly as though muffled. The mother remembered the silence that followed, not the peaceful silence of devotion, but silence too heavy, too complete. When they reached the gate, it stood half open. No priest greeted them. No novice came to lead them inside. They walked alone through the cloister. Their breath rose in clouds. The stone beneath their feet felt cold, colder than the air. The children clung to their mother's hands. She whispered for them to stay close. Inside, the abbey was dim. Candles burned, but sparingly. Most of the sconces were empty. The light clung only to the lowest corners of the nave, leaving the ceiling in shadow. And the priests were already gathered, 19 men, standing in silence at the far end of the choir. The family paused. The father whispered that they seemed altered, gaunt, pale, expressionless. He could not recall whether their lips moved when they sang, but they did sing. Slowly, faintly, a hymn rose from their throats. It was not a hymn the family knew. The melody turned strangely, circling itself, repeating fragments and patterns that seemed endless. The notes clung to the air like mist. The children buried their faces against their mother's arms. And that's when the father noticed. Every candle was set far from the priests. None burned near the altar. The light never touched their faces directly, and yet their faces could be seen. Gaunt, hollow-cheeked, eyes sunken deep into shadow. Expressionless, not the weariness of men fasting, not the pallor of men ill, but the stillness of something else. Something withdrawn. The mass continued, if it could be called a mass. The prayers were spoken too quickly, as though hurried, then drawn out again, too long, until the words became indistinct. The family recognized fragments of liturgy, but not the whole. The rhythm was wrong. The cadence was wrong. The father said it felt like listening to words through water, distorted, unfamiliar, and yet unmistakably spoken in unison. The mother's account carries another detail. She remembered the moment the priests raised their hands, not in blessing, not in gesture, but slowly, deliberately, as if they were reaching, not toward God, but toward silence itself. She could not watch. She lowered her eyes and whispered a prayer into her child's hair, but the children had already seen. One later told his confessor, years after the fact, "They looked at us, not with their eyes, with their mouths." The hymn swelled. It filled the nave. It pressed against the stone walls until it felt unbearable. And then, suddenly it stopped. The silence that followed was worse. The priests stood frozen, their faces blank, their hands still raised. The family did not wait for dismissal. The father took his wife's arm, his children's hands, and led them quickly down the nave. Their footsteps echoed in the hollow space. No priest followed. No priest spoke. The 19 remained where they were, suspended in silence. At the door, the father turned once more, and he said he saw the faintest flicker. Not movement, not breath, but shadow, as though the candlelight had bent itself wrong against the priest's faces. He did not speak of it again. The family descended the hill in silence. The mother wept without knowing why. The children cried out in their sleep that night, each waking with the same memory. The voices, not the words, but the weight. It was the last mass ever attended inside Greyfriar's Abbey. No villager returned again, and no record survives of what the 19 priests did after that night. But from that evening forward, the Abbey's doors remained closed. The candles were never seen burning again, and the songs, the unfamiliar hymns that once rolled across the valley, fell silent. Only silence remained. But the silence was heavier than sound, and it waited. The camera drifts through fog. Moonlight rests faintly on the slope of the hill, casting the Abbey in cold silver. Its roof line cuts the night like a blade. The fields below are frozen, silent, waiting, and then a light appears. A single flicker at the edge of the cloister. It is a candle, and behind it, others. The first testimony comes from a farmer named Alistair Grant. He had risen before dawn to tend to his livestock. The snow was thin that night, the sky unusually clear. He remembered the silence, the kind of silence that carries sound for miles. He was stacking wood when he saw it. 19 figures, robed in black, circling the Abbey grounds. Each held a candle. Their flames burned steady, though the air was cold and sharp. They moved in silence at first, but as the line curved around the northern wall, a sound rose with them, chanting, not loud, not raucous, but low, sustained. It carried across the frozen field until it reached him, and he froze. because it was not Latin, not even words, but a tongue he did not know. He later told his wife that the sound was like stone grinding on stone, a rhythm without meaning, a voice without shape, but it was unison. 19 men, 19 voices, carrying the same strange chant. The procession circled the Abbey once, then again, always in the same order, always with the same steady pace. Their candles glowed in rhythm, their shadows bending along the wall. The farmer said he could not move. He felt the sound pressing into his chest, the way thunder presses before it breaks. And that's when he heard it, his own heartbeat, falling into rhythm with the chant. He clutched his chest and stumbled back, breaking the spell. The moment he turned, the chanting stopped. The figures vanished behind the Abbey wall, but he did not sleep that night. He could still feel the rhythm pulsing in his ribs. He was not the only one. Other farmers gave their testimonies. A woman named Ellen Hayes described walking back from her brother's house and seeing the same sight. 19 figures circling, candlelight reflecting off their pale faces. She said they did not look at one another, did not look outward. Their eyes were fixed on the ground, as though reading something no one else could see. Her testimony adds one more detail. Each time they completed the circle, they paused at the Abbey door and bowed, then continued again, over and over. She counted 7 circuits before she could no longer bear to watch. But something wasn't right. The testimonies do not agree on what the chanting sounded like. Some described it as guttural, others as high and keening, almost like weeping. One said it was not voices at all, but something deeper, like the earth itself was humming through them. But all agreed it was not human, and yet it came from human throats. The villagers who saw it told no one at first. Fear kept them quiet, but the pattern repeated, always at midnight, always 19 figures, always the same procession, circling the Abbey, candles steady, chanting in a tongue no one could recognize. A young boy, the son of a shepherd, later said he woke one night to the sound drifting through his window. He pulled on his coat, slipped outside, and saw the procession himself. What he remembered most was not the chanting. It was the silence between, because when the voices fell still, even for a moment, the night seemed to vanish. The owl stopped calling. The wind stopped moving. The world seemed to wait. And then the chanting began again, filling the gap like water flooding a hollow. The boy said he ran until his lungs ached. The next morning, he could not speak of it without trembling. By the 3rd week of sightings, the villagers began to whisper openly. They avoided the hill. They kept shutters closed tight after dusk. Some carved crosses into their doors. But the chanting continued, every midnight, every night, until the villagers could no longer ignore it. A small group decided to climb the hill together, to see what the 19 were doing, to confront them or at least understand. They carried lanterns and walked in silence. The snow crunched underfoot, echoing too loudly in the cold night air. When they reached the base of the Abbey wall, they saw the glow of candles moving along the cloister. The procession was already circling. 19 figures, black robes brushing the stone. The villagers held their breath, and then the chanting began. This time, they heard it clearly. It was not words. It was sound bent into shape. Low, droning syllables layered and repeated, each voice weaving into the next until no single one could be heard alone. It seemed endless. One man whispered a prayer. His voice broke the rhythm. And in that instant, the 19 stopped. The candles froze. The chanting fell silent. Every head turned. 19 faces, pale, expressionless, staring into the dark where the villagers stood. The villagers fled. They did not look back. And by morning, none could agree what they had seen. Some said the priest's eyes shone in the candlelight. Others said they were black and hollow. One swore the chanting had continued, even as the mouths fell still. But they all agreed on one thing. There were 19, always 19, and they walked in a circle that never seemed to end. The midnight procession became a whisper among the villagers, a story not told outsiders, a secret carried like a wound, because what they had seen was not devotion. It was something else, something they could not name. And still, the procession continued, night after night, until no one dared look again, and silence fell over the valley. But the silence was waiting. The camera drifts slowly across the sleeping village. Thatched roofs glisten faintly in the half-light of the moon. The river runs dark and glassy beside the fields. All is still, all is calm, until the bells begin to ring. It is 3:17 in the morning. No hands on the rope, no priest in the tower. Yet the sound pours from the abbey above, heavy and metallic, rolling over the valley like thunder. The villagers stir in their beds. Curtains shift. Lanterns glow to life. Mothers lift their children close. Men step out barefoot into the cold mud, and all of them hear it. The bells toll again, and again, and again. But something wasn't right. These were not the measured peals of a call to prayer. They were uneven, strained, each strike carrying a vibration that felt less like sound and more like weight. One farmer, still half asleep, swore it pressed against his chest as though someone were standing on it. Another said the walls of his cottage quivered, dust falling from the beams with each toll. And then, just as suddenly as they had begun, the bells stopped. The silence was immediate and absolute. At first, the villagers thought they had simply ended, that some final toll had concluded the night's strange disturbance. But then they noticed the dogs had ceased barking. The cattle no longer shuffled in their stalls. The owls had gone quiet, and in that gap, not even the river could be heard. One old woman, who lived nearest the water, said she stepped outside expecting to hear the steady rush of the current that had never once failed in her lifetime. Instead, she heard nothing. She could see the surface gleaming in the moonlight, but it moved like polished stone, unnaturally still, as though some invisible hand had pressed pause on the world itself. A man walking the lane toward the abbey froze when he realized his own footsteps were the only sound left in the night. He lifted his heel and stamped it down into the dirt just to break the void. He later recalled that the dull thud was the loudest thing he had ever heard in his life. And that's when he heard it. Somewhere far off, a single chime rang again, not the full weight of the bells, but muted echo as if carried underground. He swore it did not come from the tower. It came from beneath the hill. Others told the same. A fading vibration fell to the ground itself, humming in their bones, impossible to place. In the following days, villagers spoke of the silence more than the sound. It wasn't the ringing that haunted them. It was the emptiness that followed. Bird song did not return with the morning. The fields were eerily still. Even the wind seemed to die at the edges of the abbey's walls, as though it refused to cross them. Children cried without reason that day. Livestock refused to graze. And when the sun went down again, the valley was so hushed that neighbors whispered though standing face to face, afraid to break whatever spell had fallen across the land. One boy told his father he had counted the tolls as they rang. 19 in total. Not 20, not 18, always 19. His father struck him for speaking of it, insisting there had been no pattern, no omen in it. Yet in his old age, the man admitted he too had counted 19. And when asked why he had lied to his son, he answered only because saying aloud made it real. The bells never rang again. Not by hand, not by rope. The tower stood silent for the rest of its years. But the villagers swore the silence itself never left them. On certain nights, when the sky was clear and the moonlight caught the stone of Greyfriar's Abbey, just so, they said they could feel the stillness return. It pressed down on the valley like a weight, like a breath held too long. And in that pause, hearts began to beat louder. Minds filled the void with what they feared most. Some heard whispers in the grass. Others felt the river moving beneath the frozen surface. And a few, the ones who lived closest to the hill, claimed that in the hollow of that silence, they could hear bells again, faint, beneath the earth, always 19. Never more, never less. And with each toll, they swore, the world itself seemed to grow thinner. The night the bells stopped was not forgotten. It marked the moment the village understood something had shifted. That Greyfriars was no longer a house of God. It was something else entirely. Something that waited in silence. And something that was listening. The camera drifts through a pale dawn. The Abbey sits on its hill, cloaked in mist, the stones catching the first light like cold glass. The village below stirs awake, cautious eyes fixed upward, waiting for the sound of bells that never comes. Instead, the only sound is the shuffling of boots on dirt paths, men with lanterns, women pulling shawls around their shoulders, children clinging to the edges of skirts. They walk toward the Abbey in silence. The doors are shut. At first, it doesn't seem unusual. The priests were known to rise early. Morning prayers, morning hymns. It was habit, but something wasn't right. The great oak doors are barred, not from the outside, where the iron could be unlatched with effort, but from within. No crack of light shows through. The bolts inside hold fast, heavy and deliberate, as if no one inside wished ever to be disturbed. Villagers press their ears to the wood. They expect voices. Footsteps. The low chant of 19 men at prayer. There is nothing, not even the echo of movement. Windows are shuttered, each one nailed closed. One by one, the villagers circle the building, testing them, calling out. No one answers. The blacksmith brings his tools. The men gather, with crowbars and mallets. They strike the door again and again until the wood splinters. The hinges strain, the bar cracks loose. The doors heave open with a shudder. Lanterns are lifted high. The air spills out first. Heavy, stale, unmoving, as though sealed for months. It smells not of incense nor smoke, but of stone and dust. They step inside. The nave stretches into shadow. Candles sit cold in their holders. Books lie open on wooden pews, pages stiff and curled with damp. A cloak is folded neatly on a bench, as though its owner meant to return. But no priests come forward. No voices greet them. The Abbey is empty. The villagers search room by room. First the sanctuary, where the altar stands bare, stripped of cloth. Then the refectory, where long wooden tables are set as though for a meal never eaten. Bowls, cups, knives, each one arranged but untouched. And then the cells. Each door is ajar, each bed neatly made. Candles burned to their base. Boots lined together against the wall. Robes folded at the foot, as if 19 men had prepared to rise, but never did. It is too orderly, too precise. Nothing stolen, nothing disturbed. And that's when they notice there are no signs of departure, no muddy prints at the threshold, no carriage marks in the dirt outside, no note, no farewell. It is as though the 19 priests did not leave the Abbey. It is as though they ceased to exist inside it. The search grows frantic. Men shout names into the echoing halls. Women push open cupboards, lift lids of chests, pull aside drapes, searching for any trace of the bodies they half expect to find. But the Abbey yields nothing, only silence. One farmer later recalled the way the silence clung to him. He swore he could hear his own blood in his ears, louder than the sound of his boots on the flagstones. He said it felt as though he were intruding in a place that had been abandoned for centuries. Yet the beds were warm when they touched them. Warm, as though someone had only just risen. Another remembered the bread, loaves half kneaded in the kitchen, still dusted with flour, dough left unbaked, covered with a cloth. Time had stopped, he said. It was the only explanation. The villagers left the Abbey that morning with fear in their bones. They left its doors broken, its windows open, lanterns extinguished behind them. But they could not leave behind the question, where had 19 men gone? Some claimed they had fled in the night. Others argued they had been taken. Yet the evidence betrayed both ideas. The bolts locked from within, the shutters nailed down. It was not escape. It was not abduction. It was erasure. And the longer they thought on it, the darker the truth began to feel. Because if the priests had chosen to vanish, then they had done it willingly. And if they had not, then something had chosen for them. That night, villagers barred their own doors. They prayed, not to the God the priests had served, but to silence itself, the silence that now seemed bound to the Abbey like a curse. Mothers hushed their children when they asked. Fathers forbade them to speak of it at all. But the memory lingered, of doors sealed from the inside, of windows nailed shut, of 19 lives gone without trace. And in the years that followed, whenever someone walked past the Abbey's broken gates, They always said the same thing. The building wasn't empty. It was waiting. The camera drifts low, across the cracked stone floor of the Abbey. Light falls in slanted beams through broken shutters. Dust rises in the air like ash, disturbed only by the faint movement of wind. Years had passed since the 19 priests disappeared. The Abbey had remained locked, its walls holding silence, its rooms waiting. Yet in the ruins of the sacristy, behind splintered wood and a fallen beam, something was uncovered. A drawer, hidden deep in the wood of the confessional. Inside it, wrapped in cloth eaten with damp, were journals, dozens of them, the private writings of priests who had once lived here. At first, they seemed ordinary, records of daily prayer, confessions heard, small accounts of meals shared, and hymns sung. But as the pages turned, the tone shifted. Something wasn't right. The handwriting grew frantic. The ink pressed deep into the paper, as if the words had been carved instead of written. The lines ran longer, circling thoughts, looping back to the same phrases again and again. They spoke of visions, not of saints, not of Christ, but of figures described as burning, yet not consumed, of shadows that resembled wings, stretching the length of the walls, of voices too layered to belong to any single man. And the words repeated most often were these: a calling beyond Rome. The priests had written as though they were preparing for something, a moment greater than their vows, a ritual not found in Scripture. They called a mass, but not one for the living, not one meant for ears of men. They described rehearsals, night gatherings in the chapel, words practiced in low whispers, a hymn sung without melody, a chant whose syllables were never named. One entry, written by a priest whose hand shook across the page: confess this. We have been chosen, not by Rome, not by men. We are called to prepare a mass for the heavens. Yet, the heavens do not resemble light. They do not resemble God. They resemble something older. The villagers who later read these words recoiled, for this was not devotion. This was surrender. Another journal told of sleep disturbed by visitations, men waking in their cells to find light pressing to the cracks of their eyelids, even in darkness, men whispering in their dreams, repeating words they did not know when awake, and always the same conclusion. It was not madness. It was not error. It was calling. But calling to where? The journals never answered. They circled, they hinted, they lingered. Yet the last entries carried only one refrain: the mass must be completed. It is not for men to hear. It is not for men to witness. We must seal the doors. We must close the windows. We must not be disturbed. One journal ended abruptly, a line unfinished, ink smeared across the page as though the hand had been taken away mid-sentence. Those who studied the writings afterward could not agree. Some believed the priests had suffered from collective hysteria. Others said they had been driven to secrecy by shame. Yet the detail unsettled them all, because in every journal, no matter the author, the same phrase returned: a mass never meant for human ears. And this was not written in fear. It was written in obedience. The more the pages revealed, the less the Abbey resembled a place of worship. It became a stage, a chamber for something rehearsed and never meant to be interrupted. The journal stopped short of explaining what happened the night the priests vanished. Yet the silence between the lines spoke louder than words. They had locked the doors themselves. They had shuttered the windows. They had prepared for what the pages would not say. But whatever they were waiting for, it had come. And in the end, the journals remained, words pressed into paper like confessions carved into stone. The only voices left of men who had promised silence. The villagers who read them swore never to enter the Abbey again. One farmer burned the first set he found, only to wake the next morning and find a new volume resting on his threshold. Others locked theirs in chests, hoping to forget. Yet the words pressed themselves into memory. The phrases returned in dreams. The chant hummed without sound. The image of 19 priests preparing for a mass not meant for human ears lingered, impossible to erase. And long after the last journal was read, the same question remained. If the priests had written the words themselves, who had told them what to write? The camera drifts across the ruined facade of Greyfriars Abbey. Stone walls weathered by wind. Windows broken, glass long since swallowed by weeds. The building stands empty, and yet it does not feel abandoned. In the weeks following the disappearance of the 19 priests, there should have been inquiry. There should have been letters, investigations, some kind of official word. But instead, something else happened. The diocese sealed the doors. The records vanished. And Greyfriars Abbey ceased to exist. Parishioners who came forward with questions were told the priests had been reassigned, transferred quietly with no explanation. But no new names appeared in the archives. No other parishes recorded their arrival. It was as if the priests had been moved into air. At first, the villagers accepted the statement. It was easier that way, to believe the church had relocated its servants, rather than face the emptiness on the hill. But rumors spread quickly. Men who had worked at the chancery whispered that the files had been pulled from the shelves by gloved hands, that baptismal records, ordinations, even letters signed by the abbots, had been taken, and in their place, silence. But something wasn't right. The archives did not just erase the men. They erased the abbey itself. Greyfriars, once listed in diocesan registers as a living parish, vanished from the rolls. Maps were redrawn. Official documents left a blank space on the hill. The abbey was written out of history as though it had never been consecrated, as though it had never received Rome's blessing. And yet, everyone remembered it. Old men recalled baptisms performed beneath its vaulted ceilings. Families remembered weddings, bells tolling, incense filling the nave. Funerals, too, caskets lowered into the earth behind its walls. Lives marked in a place that was now claimed never to have existed. The contradiction tore at the villagers. One day, a farmer who had lost his son demanded answers. He rode into the city, petition in hand, demanding that the bishop return the abbey's records. But when he arrived, he was told something chilling. There was never a parish called Greyfriars. You are mistaken. The words were spoken calmly, almost kindly, but the farmer knew them to be a lie. He had stood in the pews. He had heard the sermons. He had buried his boy in the soil just beyond the southern wall. He never returned to the chancery again. From that moment, silence fell over the village. Not just the silence of unanswered questions, but the silence of people too afraid to keep asking. Because others who had pressed further, clerks, scribes, even a traveling friar, were said to have lost their positions. Their names dropped quietly from rosters, their posts reassigned. Not punished, not excommunicated, just removed, like the abbey itself. And that's when whispers began. Some said the Vatican itself had intervened, that Rome had issued an instruction. Greyfriars Abbey was never to be spoken of again. Others believed the diocese had acted out of shame, that the journals, the disappearances, the strange rumors of mass not meant for human ears, had been too much of the church to admit. But the truth lay in the detail. Because if the priests had truly been reassigned, where were their names? Where were their letters of transfer? Their signatures? Their postings? They did not exist. The 19 men had simply been erased. And yet, the silence carried its own weight, for the absence itself became a presence. The villagers spoke less of the abbey with each passing year. The children were warned not to wander near the hill, and gradually, memory itself began to feel like a kind of trespass. The abbey still stood, but it belonged to no one. Locked gates rusted. Ivy crept across the walls. Birds nested in the broken windows. But no priest ever set foot inside again. To the Vatican, Greyfriars had never been consecrated. To the diocese, it was a ruin of no importance. And to the villagers, it was a shadow. But shadows have a way of clinging. One woman, decades later, claimed she had seen an official document tucked away in a library in Rome, a ledger of reassigned priests. 19 names written in neat Latin script, but where their destinations should have been listed, the columns were blank. No parishes, no dates, no future, only the names. And even those, she said, had been written in ink so faint it seemed designed to fade. No one ever found the ledger again. The silence of the church spread wider than the abbey. It crept into the speech of the faithful, into the documents of the curia, into the very memory of the clergy. Priests trained in later years swore they had never heard of Greyfriars. When told the story, they shook their heads, insisting the place had never existed. And yet, they could not explain the ruins. The Abbey remained on the hill, its walls real, its stones heavy, its shadow long in the evening light. The silence did not erase the building. It erased the story. It erased the man. And so the village lived on in the presence of an absence. A church that was not a church. An abbey that had never been. 19 priests who had simply vanished from the record. But absence is not the same as peace. For silence is its own kind of weight. And sometimes, silence speaks louder than truth. In the end, the villagers stopped asking. They stopped writing letters. They stopped remembering aloud. But the memory remained in other ways. In dreams, in the stillness of the hill at night, in the feeling that the 19 were still waiting behind their sealed doors. And so the silence of the church became the silence of the land itself. Unbroken, unacknowledged, unanswered, until the day when someone would dare to open the gates again. The camera drifts slowly over a white hill, the snow untouched, silent, except for a sound, faint, almost imagined the distant toll of the bell. Hikers say it happens when the air is clear, when the wind drops, and when the woods around Greyfriars Abbey fall into a silence too deep to be natural. At first, they thought it was nothing, a trick of the wind, the shifting of ice in the valley, the echo of some farmhouse bell carried further than it should. But something wasn't right, because the Abbey has no bell. It hasn't for over a century, yet still the sound is heard. Single, hollow tolls, drifting from the hill where the Abbey once stood, measured, rhythmic, and never stopping when someone listens closely enough. Those who have climbed the hill in winter tell a different story. When the snow lies deep, the ground becomes a page, and something writes upon it. 19 footprints, pressed deep into the ice, not in a line, not toward a destination, but in circles, endless, tightening circles. Always 19, never more, never less, and always returning to the same spot near the collapsed wall of the Abbey, a place where, they say, the altar once stood. One hiker, a man from the nearby town of Keswick, described it plainly. He and 2 friends had gone up the hill one January night, curious about the old stories. The snow was thick, the kind that squeaks under boots. The moon was high, throwing silver over the ruined stones. And then he saw them, prints, too large to be a child's, too narrow to be a farmer's boots. They formed a perfect circle, each impression following the last, like something had walked the same path again and again, never tiring. He put his foot into one, and that's when he heard it. The bell, not far, not distant, but close, as though it were inside the ruins themselves. A sound that carried no air, no echo, only weight. He swore it rang not into the night, but into his chest. They left quickly. No one spoke on the way down, and when they returned days later, the prints were gone, but the circle remained pressed into the earth, long after the snow had melted. Others tell of similar findings. Always winter, always the snow, always 19 steps. Some claim they've seen the circle form before their eyes, not in seconds, not with sudden magic, but slowly, an impression deepening while they watched, as if something invisible was pressing down, pacing patiently, continuing its endless turn. The diocese, of course, denies it. Local officials dismiss the hikers as drunk or mistaken. No records mention bells or footsteps or anything beyond the accepted ruins of Greyfriars Abbey. But locals whisper, and always with the same phrase, they're still waiting. The 19 priests who vanished, the abbey that sealed itself, the journals that spoke of a mass beyond Rome, all of it left unfinished, all of it cut short. And now, the hill waits too. There is a belief, though it is rarely voiced aloud, that the 19 are still there, walking their circle, not as ghosts, not as men, but as something in between, bound by their unfinished ritual, bound by the hymn they wrote but never sang. And those who have listened carefully say the bells match a rhythm, not random, not a wandering sound, but deliberate, a cadence, the beginning of a song, a hymn without words, calling into the night, waiting for an answer. And though no one dares to continue the sound, they fear the day someone does. Because if the hymn is sung again, the circle may break, and what waits inside may finally step free. The bell tolls, the snow falls, the footprints remain, and Greyfriar's Hill never sleeps. Not entirely, because something still moves there, slowly, endlessly, waiting for the mass never meant for human ears. And if you listen carefully enough, you might hear it, the sound of 19 footsteps, pacing, turning, tracing their circle beneath the snow, and the faint, hollow toll of the bell that hasn't existed for over 100 years, yet rings. All the same, the camera lingers on the hill, cold, silent. Nothing moves, not even the trees. The ruins of Greyfriars sit heavy in the frame, their stones blackened by time, their outlines eroded to the memory of walls. No voices, no prayers, just silence, but not an ordinary silence. It is thick, it is watchful, it is the kind of silence that presses against the skin, that waits, that listens back. 19 priests entered here. They did not leave. Their names remain in the old records. Their faces appear in parish archives. Their movements are charted until the final night. And then nothing. The world outside never saw them again. Not a body, not a word, not a trace. The doors were sealed. The windows shuttered. The Abbey withdrew from the world. And when it finally opened, it was empty. No hymn books scattered across pews. No robes abandoned in the sacristy. No chalices left out as if mid-mass. Everything had been put away, ordered, as though the Abbey itself was preparing for something final. And then it was gone. People have asked for centuries what happened that night. Were they taken by faith, or by something older than faith itself? The Church offers no answer. The Vatican never issued a statement. The diocese filed the ruins as uninhabitable, and the priests became footnotes. But something wasn't right, because 19 men do not vanish into silence without leaving a mark. In the town below, the villagers speak quietly. They say their fathers remembered seeing faint light on the hill that night, a pale glow in the upper windows. Steady, not flickering like candles, but something stronger, something that looked like fire without smoke. And then, nothing. The light was gone. The hill darkened, and the Abbey never sang again. One man, a shepherd who lived his whole life in the valley, left a note among his possessions. It was found by his grandchildren years after his death. He wrote that, in the days after the priest vanished, the air on the hill changed. It tasted of iron. It pressed into the lungs. It made his sheep refuse to graze near the Abbey walls. And he ended his note with a single line. They were not taken by God. There are others who believe differently, that the 19 were chosen, that they crossed a threshold that faith alone cannot reach, that silence was not the absence of God, but the presence of something greater. And in that silence, they disappeared. Greyfriars remains untouched. No restoration projects. No archaeological digs. Not even tourists are allowed beyond the fence that circles the hill. The land is marked as dangerous, unstable, unsafe, but those who have stood at the fence line say differently. The ground feels solid. The ruins stand as they have for centuries, unmoving, unbroken. What they feel instead is a silence. It swallows sound. Footsteps fall too soft. Whispers seem to fade before they reach the ear. Even the birds do not fly overhead. One researcher, who visited the site in the late 1990s, described it in his notes. He wrote, "It is not that the Abbey is quiet. It is that the Abbey resists noise. It consumes it. You can hear your own heart louder than the world around you, and it does not feel like absence. It feels like listening." And that's when he heard it. Not bells, not voices, but something behind the silence. A hum, low, constant, beneath the threshold of sound, but undeniably there. He left that night and never returned. His notes ended with final phrase. They are still here, What lingers in Greyfriars cannot be named. It does not reveal itself. It does not leave evidence for historians or believers to point toward. It remains what it has always been, a silence that devours, a silence that waits, and perhaps a silence that warns. Because the Abbey has not crumbled. Its stones remain. Its outlines still stand, unmoved by centuries of storms, unaffected by time. The villagers say the land protects it, that the ruin does not decay because it is already complete, not broken, not unfinished, but finished in a way no human eye can recognize. It stands not as a ruin, but as a monument to 19 men, to faith stretched too far, to silence heavier than words. And yet, no one dares to touch it. The clergy avoid it. The locals avoid it. Even the curious step no further than the fence. Because if the silence has lasted this long, perhaps it is not meant to be broken. Greyfriars remains untouched, and untouched it will remain. But its silence carries. It seeps into memory, into stories told in whispers, into hikers who swear the hill watches them when the air grows still. The Abbey does not move, but its silence reaches. And that silence is the loudest warning of all, the warning that faith can swallow, that men can vanish, that history can choose to forget. And yet the hill remembers, always, because before dawn, when the world is still dark, the silence deepens. It is the hour when night has not ended, when morning has not begun, and when Greyfriars seems most alive. There are those who believe this was the hour they vanished, that 19 men entered the silence, one by one, and were taken whole, not by violence, not by struggle, but by surrender, by stepping into something no prayer could reach, no ritual could hold, something older than faith itself. And in that hour, the Abbey closed its eyes. Since then, it has never opened them. The hill remains, the silence endures, and the warning is clear. Not everything that calls itself holy is of God. Not every silence is peace. And not every prayer is answered. Sometimes, silence is the only reply. Greyfriars gives no explanation, no comfort, no closure, only silence. Silent before dawn, silent after, silent still. And in that silence, 19 priests remain, not living, not dead, but waiting for faith to find them, or for something older to call them again. Until then, the Abbey stands, watching, listening, silent, and if you ever walk too close, you may discover the truth, that silence is not empty. It is full, and it is listening. The priests vanished not in blood, but in devotion. Their disappearance suggests that faith, when pushed beyond obedience, becomes indistinguishable from surrender.